Welcome to the debate. When structural engineers design a skyscraper, they face this fundamental, terrifying tension. If they make the building entirely rigid, the first major earthquake it'll just snap it in half.
Right, it needs to sway.
Exactly. It needs to sway. It has to respond to the shifting environment. But, if it's too flexible, if it simply yields to every single gust of wind, the structure becomes unlivable. The elevator shafts warp, and eventually the whole thing collapses under its own lack of resistance. It requires a foundational rigidity to remain standing at all.
Yeah, you are constantly balancing responsiveness with structural integrity. And if you miscalculate either one, the collapse is catastrophic.
We see this exact tension in human governance, and it is the central focus of Dr. Antonio Arnold's book, Democracy versus Constitutional Republic, a clear comparison for modern citizens. I look at Arnold's work and I take away one undeniable fact. The constitutional republic is that necessary steel frame. Its separation of powers, the strict rule of law, those are the only things keeping majority rule from devolving into tyranny.
And I look at the exact same mechanisms, and I argue that the frame has become a cage. The complex machinery of a constitutional republic, it inherently dilutes the public will, creates perpetual gridlock, and ultimately empowers special interests over the actual citizens.
Let's start with the raw math of pure democracy. On paper, majoritarianism sounds like ultimate freedom, right? The people get exactly what the people want.
Sure.
But majority rule is inherently volatile. The psychological reality of mass movements is that they're reactive to the passions of the moment. If 51% of the population suddenly decides in a moment of panic or anger to strip the property, speech, or voting rights of the 49%,
then they can just do it.
Exactly. A pure democracy offers zero structural defense. A constitutional republic prioritizes the slow, predictable rule of law over those fleeting desires. By delegating power to representatives and constraining them with a Bill of Rights, we create a reliable horizon. Human nature requires boundaries. The slow pace of our system isn't a failure, it's a feature. It is a calculated buffer against the mob.
I come at it from a different way. Because the theoretical elegance you're describing simply doesn't survive contact with reality. You talk about protecting the 49% from this 51%.
Which it does.
But what the mechanisms of a constitutional republic actually do in practice is protect the top 1% from the other 99. Arnold makes a really fascinating point about this in his analysis of the legislative path. You praise the slow pace, but look at the actual architecture of that slowness. A piece of legislation has to survive committee markups, floor debates, passage through two distinct rival chambers, and secure a presidential signature.
Which ensures broad consensus.
No. It ensures maximum vulnerability to elite capture. It creates this obstacle course of choke points. Think about the economic incentives here. If a public initiative has massive majoritarian support, say comprehensive healthcare reform or data privacy regulation, a lobbyist doesn't need to defeat it in a national vote.
Because of the republic's structure, they only need to buy off one subcommittee chair or attach one poison pill rider in the Senate to kill the democratic will of millions. So while we praise the system for protecting the minority, we have to admit that the minority it frequently protects is a very small, incredibly well-funded elite who know how to navigate the labyrinth.
I see why you think that. But let me give you a different perspective on that legislative labyrinth. You're viewing it purely as a toll booth for special interests. But I look at those exact same mechanics and see a crucible. Think of committee markups and floor debates as literal pressure valves. Competing regional and economic interests provide the heat,
Okay, but
Let me just finish this thought. The friction of the process is designed to burn away the reactionary, extreme fringe elements of a bill until only the most universally acceptable core of the policy remains.
is it burning away the fringe elements, or is it burning away the actual efficacy of the law? We aren't living in an agrarian society anymore. Modern issues, artificial intelligence, global supply chain crises, climate engineering, they move at an exponential pace.
They do, yes.
Right, so when you force a comprehensive, desperately needed solution through a multi-year crucible of horse trading, The result isn't necessarily a refined consensus. It's often a Frankenstein's monster of a bill. It gets so watered down and laden with contradictory compromises that it completely fails to solve the crisis it was drafted to address. The structural friction you praise actively prevents the state from serving the modern citizen.
Okay, but if we regulated the internet based on majoritarian panic in 1999, what would we have today? Probably a stifled, completely state-managed network. The complexity of modern issues is staggering, I grant you that. But that complexity is exactly why we cannot afford rapid, purely majoritarian responses.
I don't know if I agree with that.
Well, think about it. If national policy swings wildly every 2 years because public sentiment shifted by 3 percentage points, you destroy the stability required for long-term implementation. Capital markets would freeze, infrastructure projects would collapse. The deliberation required by the constitutional republic ensures that diverse regional interests are factored in. A senator from an agricultural state and a representative from a coastal tech hub are forced to find common ground.
Do they find common ground, though? Let's look at the actual game theory of that interaction. Your crucible metaphor assumes the people inside it are acting in good faith, trying to forge a national consensus. But the Republic relies on a two-party system to organize these factions. And the incentive structure of a two-party duopoly doesn't reward compromise. It rewards zero-sum obstruction.
Only in periods of hyperpolarization. Historically, it has been an engine for stability.
I would argue it's an engine for stagnation. Arnold dissects this beautifully. In a two-party system, the primary objective is to win the next election, which often means ensuring the opposing party achieves absolutely nothing of value. We don't see broad coalitions forming to solve healthcare. We see profound gridlock.
Because it's a contentious issue.
No, necessary reforms are installed because lawmakers are carefully deliberating the philosophical nuances of policy. They are stalled simply because a party leader refuses to bring a bill to the floor to deny the opposition a win. So the constitutional machinery isn't fostering consensus at all. It's fostering institutional paralysis.
Look, I will readily acknowledge that partisan polarization is a severe vulnerability in the current climate. But I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because you are entirely dismissing the historical utility of the big tent. Look at the alternative. In a pure democracy or a parliamentary system with a dozen fragmented single-issue parties, coalition governments can collapse overnight.
But they're highly responsive.
Responsive to a fault. A fringe party representing 5% of the electorate can hold the entire national budget hostage to get their radical demands met.
Instead of a subcommittee chair holding it hostage?
The difference is accountability. The two-party system in America forces extreme factions to moderate their platforms before they can govern. It absorbs diverse competing interests into two main tents. Look at the New Deal coalition. It brought together incredibly disparate groups, urban workers, rural farmers, recent immigrants, and forced them to find a shared, moderate baseline. It translates radical, single-issue ideas into actionable, broad-based policy. It prevents the dangerous fragmentation that tears other democracies apart.
But at what cost to the citizen's voice? You say it forces moderation, but the political reality is that candidates increasingly cater to their party's extreme base to survive primaries. And more importantly, it artificially limits the representation of diverse perspectives. If a citizen is fiscally conservative but socially progressive, or vice versa, their worldview is effectively orphaned by the binary choices presented.
They have to prioritize, yeah.
But they are silenced in the legislative process. And when emerging political movements arise, whether they are pushing for unprecedented social justice reforms or redefining traditional values, they have to fight against the constraints of this entrenched duopoly. The system doesn't seamlessly absorb them, it suppresses them until the pressure reaches a breaking point.
Yet, they do eventually influence the main platforms. The parties evolve or they die. But let's follow the logic of this gridlock you're describing. If we accept, for the sake of argument, that the legislative branch is hopelessly gridlocked by partisan battles, you eventually hit a wall. And in a constitutional republic, that wall is the judiciary. The ultimate triumph of this model, the ultimate defense mechanism, is the power of judicial review.
A triumph? The judiciary is arguably the most anti-democratic feature of the entire system.
It is a triumph specifically because it is counter-majoritarian. Let's look at the historical reality of the 13th and 14th Amendments. Those amendments established the absolute baseline of human dignity and equal protection under the law.
Right.
But for a century after they were passed, local majorities in the South voted over and over again to sustain segregation and strip minorities of their rights. Majoritarianism was actively hostile to freedom. The judiciary was the firewall. When a state legislature passes a law violating free speech or equal protection, the Supreme Court can strike it down.
Historically, yes, but
In a pure democracy, if the mob votes to suppress a minority, there is no higher authority to say, no, this violates our foundational text. The courts ensure that the legal definitions of freedom remain intact, completely insulated from the immediate vicious passions of the electorate.
that's a compelling argument. But have you considered the incredibly precarious nature of how that firewall is constructed? You are praising them as insulated, objective guardians of freedom, but let's look at the implications of the Supreme Court structure. You have 9 individuals. They are nominated by the executive and confirmed by the Senate, an unavoidably partisan, highly politicized process. The polarization we just agreed infects the legislature, absolutely dictates judicial appointments.
But once appointed, they serve for life. They are freed from the election cycle.
Which means they are freed from accountability to the people they govern. When you hand absolute veto power to 9 lifetime appointees, you aren't just protecting the minority, you are enshrining a microscopic oligarchy. You argue they are just applying the law, but the interpretation of the Constitution is highly subjective. It is driven by the personal, political, and philosophical ideology of those 9 individuals. Evolving standards versus originalism, these aren't objective mathematical formulas, they are ideological frameworks.
But their job is to interpret the text, not draft new policy. If lawmakers violate the Constitution, the court's duty is to undermine them.
The reality is that the lines blur. Judicial review frequently allows the court to act as a super legislature. When the court strikes down a piece of legislation, say a Voting Rights Act or a campaign finance reform bill, that was debated for years, passed by elected representatives, and signed by the president, it is effectively silencing the democratic voice of 330 million citizens. It bypasses the entire crucible you just praised.
But
There are no committee hearings, no public input, no required consensus. 9 people hand down a ruling, and it becomes the supreme law of the land. How can a system claim to champion the separation of powers when one unelected body holds the ultimate trump card over the rest of the government? It deeply erodes public trust.
it erodes the trust of the majority when they don't get their way, perhaps. But James Madison was initially skeptical of a Bill of Rights for this very reason. He eventually realized that without explicit codified protections, human rights would always be at the mercy of the 51%. The judiciary is the teeth of the Bill of Rights.
It's subjective teeth, though.
Yes, the appointment process is political, but once seated, justices are bound by historical precedent, by rigorous legal frameworks, and by the public visibility of their written opinions. They provide a vital, structural counterbalance. If we gut their power of judicial review because we fear they are anti-democratic, we are voluntarily removing the only structural defense the vulnerable minority has against the tyranny of the majority.
It forces the legislature to draft laws based not on what is best for the country, but on the anticipated ideological whims of the current court. That's a very different kind of constraint. It means our rights and our governance aren't actually determined by a stable, predictable constitution, but by the shifting political makeup and mortality of a 9-member panel.
Which brings us back to that foundational tension we started with, the swaying of the skyscraper. To summarize my perspective on Arnold's work, while the mechanics of a constitutional republic are undoubtedly slow, deeply frustrating, and incredibly complex, those features are vital bulwarks. The separation of powers, the legislative choke points, the 2-party coalitions, and yes, the ultimate veto of the judiciary. They all act in concert to force deliberation. They force competing factions to engage with one another rather than simply dominating one another. This system is intentionally designed to be difficult to change so that our fundamental liberties remain secure against the fleeting storms of public opinion.
And to summarize my perspective, we have to remain ruthlessly honest about the real-world costs of that system.
The structural hurdles that were meant to provide stability have over time created avenues for special interests to dominate, partisan polarization to cause endless stagnation, and judicial overreach to completely override the democratic voice of the citizenry. We cannot just fetishize the architecture of the republic. We have to recognize when the machinery itself becomes a barrier to the public good, rather than a protector of it.
Yet, despite our profound disagreement on the efficacy of these structures, I think we converge on a core reality of Arnold's analysis. Whether you believe the system is a brilliantly designed crucible or a broken labyrinth, active citizen participation is the only variable that makes it function at all.
I completely agree. Whether citizens are organizing to push legislation through those difficult choke points, fighting in the courts to protect their civil liberties, or building alternative political movements to challenge the two-party duopoly, relentless engagement is the only way to hold power accountable. A constitutional republic is not a self-sustaining perpetual motion machine. If the citizens check out, the special interests immediately fill the void.
Precisely. And there is an immense amount of depth in Arnold's material regarding how these philosophical structures clash in real modern scenarios. For instance, listeners should absolutely dive into the book's exploration of the official language debate. It is a brilliant, granular case study on how the tension between national identity, democratic inclusion, and constitutional constraints actually plays out in our communities.
It really is. It strips away the abstract theory and forces you to ask, how do we legally balance the human desire for cohesive national unity with the reality of cultural pluralism? It's exactly where the rigid legal frameworks crash head-on into fluid democratic needs.
It is the ultimate stress test. So we leave you to weigh these arguments and explore the source material for yourself. Think back to our skyscraper. Is the rigid steel of our constitutional framework the only thing keeping the building from collapsing in the wind? Or has the framework become so dense and inflexible that the people living inside can no longer breathe?